Hello AP World History students, Mr. Lassiter here, and in this video we're going to continue our look at time period 6, key concept 6.2. As you watch this review video for your AP World History exam, take a look at the packets linked in the description down below to complete as you watch these videos, or take a look at any of the other videos on the key concepts to this point. These are meant to be overview videos, so if you need any more information, take a look at AP Worldopedia or Freemanpedia, two of my favorite sites, although they're not affiliated with these videos, or ask your teacher or check your textbook. So let's go ahead and get started looking at this key concept. And it says, quote, "Peoples and states around the world challenge the existing political and social order in varying ways, leading to unprecedented worldwide conflicts." So, of course, off the top of our head, we know World War I and World War II will fit in this area, as will the Cold War, but we'll see several challenges to the existing political and social order that you may or may not be familiar with. So let's go ahead and get started, keeping in mind that at the beginning of this time period, Europe dominated the global political order. But both land-based and transoceanic empires that we see in this time period gave way to new states by the century's end, and in some cases, very near to the century's beginning. So let's take a look at some of those. Key concept 6.21a says the older land-based Ottoman, Russian, and Qing empires collapsed due to a combination of internal and external factors. So these are our three good examples of land-based empires that struggle, especially in the first 2 decades of this time period. The Qing Empire, for example, suffered economic stagnation and failed reforms, and some political instability internally. Externally, of course, they faced European imperial pressures. And then even later on, after the new state, Republic of China, is established under the Nationalists, they're going to face further internal and external pressures. Internal pressures from the Communist Party, external pressures from the Japanese. The Ottoman Empire similarly faced these pressures. Internally, they were weakening. They faced several nationalist movements and separatist movements, some of which had been successful, some of which was causing turmoil in the empire. And externally, of course, their military defeat in World War I led to the end of the official Ottoman Empire and the creation of the new state of Turkey. The Russian Empire also sees similar struggles. Political and social discontent internally in Russia, the poor conditions for the peasant classes, all of this combines to set the stage for revolution. And add to that an external reason of the devastation that World War I wreaked on the Russian Empire leads to what ends up being a double revolution. First, an overthrow of the Tsar, and then later the overthrow of the provisional government and the rise of the Bolsheviks, or the Communist Party of Russia. The new state, of course, establishes the Soviet Union, or USSR. So we keep in mind kind of early in this time period, these older empires are going away. And between the two world wars, European states actually are able to maintain control over their colonies. And in some cases, they're actually able to gain additional territories. And we can see this certainly with the British and the French, who maintain a hold on most of their empires. The British Empire stretching around the world, and you can see the French Empire there in the middle, covering much of West Africa, French Indochina in Southeast Asia. And some European powers even expand. The fascist Italian state, for example, will expand in East Africa. So European countries in this interwar period, unlike some of the land-based empires we just saw, are able to maintain that control, but we will see that change after World War II. At the end of World War II, many colonies gained their independence, and some of these negotiated their independence, while others achieved independence through armed struggle. So let's start with colonies that negotiated their independence. The best example of this, and one that we will return to later, is the colony of India. India, of course, negotiated its independence with Britain. They had hoped for it after World War I. They achieved independence after World War II, and this was done through the efforts of the Indian National Congress and the All India Muslim League, and eventually India is created, or an independent state is created. Of course, it is partitioned into India and Pakistan. But other places also negotiate their independence. The Gold Coast, now known as Ghana, negotiates its independence from the British Empire, and several states in French West Africa, including Guinea, Senegal, Benin, and others, are able to negotiate their independence from France. Although some of these colonies negotiate their independence, others take up arms and fight back. Algeria and Vietnam are some of the best examples from France. You may have talked about the Algerian War in your courses, as the French did not want to let that colony go because many European Frenchmen had settled in that region. So armed conflict was the result. In Vietnam, anti-colonialists fought against the Japanese and the French for independence. Ho Chi Minh was one of these leaders. Of course, that will lead eventually to U.S. involvement trying to contain communism. But nevertheless, this armed struggle of Vietnam from France leads to its independence. Other examples we see is Angola from Portugal, and in Kenya we see things like the Mau Mau Rebellion against the British Empire, and eventually Kenya will gain its full independence. Now, as we see this anti-imperialism develop in the 20th century, and the push for the dissolution of empires and restructuring of states, we see a lot of emerging ideologies. First and foremost, we think about nationalist leaders and parties who in Asia and Africa sought varying degrees of autonomy within or just total independence from imperial rule. Some examples of these, of course, are the Indian National Congress, and we associate that, of course, with Mohandas Gandhi and Nehru, who you see pictured here. Not pictured here is, of course, the Muslim League, which we'll come to in a second, but they also push for something similar, although with more of a religious ideology behind it. Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, also a very nationalist leader, uniting the Vietnamese against the imperial desires of France. And lastly, in Ghana, another leader who negotiated independence, Kwame Nkrumah. In some places, we see regional, religious, and ethnic movements challenging colonial rule, as well as challenging inherited imperial boundaries. A good example of this, of course, is the Muslim League. This was, of course, a religious movement of Muslims in India to push for a separate state. And this is led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who you see pictured here. The Muslim League and the Indian National Congress worked together for independence, but had different end goals. The Muslim League believing that a majority South Asian state of India would not, a majority Hindu South Asian state of India would not look out for their interests, really believed that a separate Muslim majority state in the northwest and the east of India was the most desired result. And this partition of India, of course, led to some conflicts within the country, conflicts between Muslims and Indians, displacement of Muslims and Hindus in this region. Eventually, we see the states of India and Pakistan established, although East Pakistan becomes known as Bangladesh when it becomes independent. Another example of this is the Quebecois separatist movement in Canada. So when we think about Quebec in Canada, it became part of the independent Canadian state after independence from Great Britain. And Great Britain had taken over Quebec in our last time period. But the people of Quebec, having their French heritage, speaking the French language, of course, have this inherited boundary being part of Canada. And there is a push for independence for Quebec, which is flared up several times throughout history. There have been referendums, none of which have been successful, though, and Quebec still remains a part of the country of Canada. Another example of this ethnic, religious, regional movement is the Biafra secessionist movement in Nigeria, as the people of Biafra sought to recreate this former powerful state in West Africa. Of course, transnational movements are also something that we must keep in mind, as they sought to unite people across national boundaries. And the big examples of this we see, of course, are communism. As you see here, communism united people across the world. It was, of course, something in the Cold War that Western countries feared, this spread of this transnational movement, but still very successful in Russia, China, Southeast Asia, parts of Africa and Latin America, Eastern Europe as well. But these transnational movements are found outside of kind of this communist ideology and can sometimes be established due to geographic and cultural interests. For example, in the Middle East and North Africa, the Pan-Arab movement, Pan-Arabism, was a transnational movement that sought to unite people across borders, from Egypt to Libya and Algeria, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, but across the Middle East. One of the major leaders of this movement, of course, was Gamal Abdel Nasser, among others. We also see a similar movement in Africa, Pan-Africanism, led by people like Kwame Nkrumah, who we've already talked about, and Jomo Kenyatta, seeking to unite the African peoples together in order to put forth their own best interests, especially in light of European dominance. Some of these emerging ideologies, these emerging changes that were coming about in this time period, were not just against political imperialism. They arose in opposition to neocolonialism and economic imperialism as well. And a good example of this is the Mexican Revolution, which rises in opposition to this economic imperialism, eventually pushing for the redistribution of land and the nationalizing of certain industries, including American industries and British industries like the oil industries. Other movements to redistribute land and resources developed within states, not just in Latin America, but also in Africa and Asia, and they sometimes even advocated communism or socialism in order to get these reforms through, and they became very popular in places throughout Latin America. In many parts of the world, religious movements even sought to redefine the relationship between the individual and the state. And this key concept 6.2 Roman numeral 2e, is a very new key concept. And so we don't have at this time, in early 2018, a full sense of what may be asked about this. But AP World History teachers have put our minds together, and some of the most common responses to how to address this key concept include thinking about the Zionist movement and the creation of Israel, thinking about these religious movements which see individuals and states shaping their or developing kind of a new relationship. Of course, the creation of an Israel state, a homeland for Jewish people, and of course Jews from all over the world being able to go to Israel and achieve citizenship. We also see this with fundamentalist movements throughout the world. The fundamentalist Iranian Revolution, of course, sought to capitalize on kind of the reaction against Western incursion into Iran, this Westernization, and wanted to bring back kind of this more fundamentalist Islamic state based on Islamic Sharia law. There are other examples too. The Falun Gong movement in China became very popular, especially in the second half of the 20th century. And in kind of purifying or having people purify themselves in this religion, they even cautioned people to stay out of the affairs of the state. And in the United States here, the Christian right movement, for example, the growth of the fundamentalist moral majority movement in the United States even sought to get people more involved in politics, more involved in the affairs of the state by appealing to fundamentalist Christianity, trying to get people to vote on those issues such as abortion, for example, trying to get politicians into government that would support these Christian right movements. For key concept 6.2, Roman numeral 2e, if there is more information that you seek, I would take a look at those websites I pointed you to earlier, and then also talk with your teachers about it. This is one that I'm going to be interested to see what is asked on the AP exam. Moving on, let's take a look at political changes that were accompanied by major demographic and social consequences. First of all, we see in this time period that old colonial boundaries are often redrawn, and that led to conflict as well as population displacement and resettlement. Two of our best examples of this are the partitioning of India and Pakistan and the population displacements following the creation of the State of Israel. And you see both of those here. The partition of India and Pakistan led to a movement of Hindu and Sikh refugees from what would become Pakistan into India, and movements of Muslim refugees in the opposite direction. This also led to outbreaks of physical violence between radicals on both sides. And with the creation of the State of Israel, we saw a large settlement of Jewish persons in Israel, and even as Israel declared independence and expanded its borders after a series of wars, after being attacked by some of the states around them, Israel's settlements in the West Bank have increasingly caused the displacement of ethnic Palestinians in the region. Of course, this is something that's in the news today, and it's hotly debated on both ends. So we're not taking a stance one way or the other here, but just acknowledging that population displacement has taken place with these redrawing of old colonial boundaries. As we've seen these major political changes around the world, the changes and the demographic effects are not just seen in, say, a country that has become independent, right? Instead, what we actually see is that this causes shifts in population around the world. One example of this is the migration of former colonial subjects to imperial metropoles. And a metropole is just the parent state of a colony. And so, for example, even though Britain had gained independence from Britain, India had gained independence from Britain, we still see in this time period a large migration of South Asians to Britain, Algerians to France, Filipinos to the United States. All three of these states, of course, are independent now, but there had been a large influx of former colonial subjects to these metropoles. And of course, there are still cultural and economic ties between these places, even after the dissolution of empires. And there are a lot more examples of this too, but these are three of the strongest examples that we have for the course. Other demographic and social consequences that come with political changes are, in some ways, much more somber. The rise of extremist groups in power led to, of course, the annihilation of specific populations. And so we see this most notably with the Holocaust during World War II. But there were other atrocities, acts of genocide, and ethnic violence that came along with major political changes. Some examples of this include in World War I, what has become known as the Armenian Genocide from 1914 to 1923, as the Ottoman/Turkish government believed that Armenians were working against them and were subverting their interests, and so they ended up committing many atrocities which have now been labeled genocide, although the Turkish government has not acknowledged that themselves. As I mentioned, in the 1930s and 40s, the Holocaust that occurs in Germany and, well, even more broadly in a German-dominated Europe during the war, stands as kind of our most significant example of this, as we saw 6 million Jewish people plus many millions of others killed by the Germans. But if we turn our attention to Southeast Asia, for example, in Cambodia in the 1970s, more examples of this ethnic violence as Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge executed hundreds of thousands, though I don't know the number exactly off the top of my head. It may have crossed into the millions of people in Cambodia in what become known as the killing fields. Of course, these atrocities only discovered later. And more recently in Rwanda in the 1990s, the Rwandan genocide that occurred as Hutus slaughtered Tutsis in this region. Now, there are other examples of this as well, many other examples of ethnic conflict. We see some in the Kosovo War of the 1990s. We've seen it in Darfur and Sudan. So not something that has ended by any means, but these are certainly four of the more significant examples that we have for this course. At this point, we are about halfway through this video. We've been about 20 minutes in, but Key Concept 6.2, like we saw in Unit 5 with Key Concept 5.3, it is quite hefty. So if you need to take a break, now would be the time, because our next key concept we're looking at is 6.2 Roman numeral 4, which is about how military conflicts occurred on an unprecedented global scale. And so we're going to start this by thinking about World War I. Now, if we think about the scale of this war, if you just look at this map for people who took a side in the war, in one way or the other, we really do not see wars occur like this until the 20th century because of this interconnectedness of this global world that has developed. Now, what causes World War I? Well, there are several, but of course historians agree that militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism in Europe all play a role in developing the tensions which will lead to war. Of course, the spark is found in the Balkans, where we have this powder keg of nationalism developing, some regions wanting to gain independence from Austria-Hungary trying to assert its independence in some regions, of course Serbs trying to help Bosnians, and what it amounts to is this region that is allied with these other more powerful major powers in Europe. And when Archduke Franz Ferdinand is assassinated by a Serbian nationalist, war breaks out. The war is, of course, we characterize it as a total war, which we'll talk about momentarily, but it is known especially for its new weaponry, the use of poison gas, machine guns, submarines, tanks, these new industrial machines for war in a war that was still fighting with somewhat outdated tactics. Of course, we see unprecedented casualties as well. The outcomes of World War I, as you see on your review packet, include that mass devastation, large numbers of deaths and casualties. We can't forget that it spurs on a revolution in Russia, leading to a communist regime. At the end of the war, of course, Germany is forced to take the blame, pay reparations, and demilitarize. Borders in Europe are redrawn, although not to the total satisfaction of Wilson's outlined 14 points. But the Austro-Hungarian Empire comes to an end. The Ottoman Empire is dissolved. The Middle East has its borders redrawn, and a mandate system is established with Britain and France in control. A League of Nations, an international organization, is created out of this war with the hopes of preventing any conflict like this from ever happening again. Of course, there are many more outcomes, but these are some of the more significant ones that came to my mind. As we know, this conflict is not a one-and-done affair. 20 years later, We see the outbreak of another war on this unprecedented global scale, and we want to think about its causes and outcomes as well. If we think about those causes, one thing that we see is expansionism, especially by Germany, Italy, and Japan. We saw that with Italy earlier, and here you can see that idea with Germany and Japan wanting access to more resources in the Pacific, invades Manchuria, starts a war with China, and begins taking over islands in the Pacific. There's also militarism that develops in this war. There were problems with the Treaty of Versailles and the failure of the League of Nations, which lead many to just list World War I as a cause for World War II. The war itself, of course, is fought less so on fronts than in theaters, a European theater and a Pacific theater, although there are fronts within Europe. On one side, of course, the Allies are led by the United States, Britain, Russia, and the resistance in France, and the Axis powers being Japan, Germany, and Italy in this war. As far as our outcomes, once again, World War II sees mass devastation and deaths. Especially, we saw an example of that earlier as we were thinking about the Holocaust. There is the division and occupation of Germany after World War II, Germany which remains divided until the Berlin Wall comes down in 1989. Japan is occupied, although their occupation leads to the United States investing in and helping Japan recover after the war, Japan fully recovering in terms of economic output by 1949. The war, of course, sees an iron curtain descend across Europe as right after World War II, the United States and Britain on one side, you think of them as Western European powers, and the Soviet Union will not necessarily see eye to eye on things like elections in Eastern European states. And so, of course, what will result is the Cold War. We also enter the atomic age, the United States dropping the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And lastly, if we can really think lastly, there are of course many more. The creation of the United Nations, a worldwide organization which has more staying power than the League of Nations. The League of Nations dissolves and the United Nations is created. So these are some of the outcomes of these wars, just to think kind of broadly about them and their unprecedented global scale. So let's get a little bit more into these wars as total wars. And we tend to think of this term total war as a war in which every available weapon is used and the nation's full financial resources are devoted. And by that definition, these wars certainly were total. Governments use a variety of strategies to mobilize populations. For example, political speeches. You've probably seen newsreels of Hitler and Mussolini speaking from balconies. We also, you may have heard speeches given, for example, by Winston Churchill over the radio, or the fireside chats of President Franklin Roosevelt. These speeches were designed to mobilize people both in the home country and colonies and former colonies for the purpose of gaining support and even waging war. Also, art and the media were used, whether it was The Triumph of the Will, created in Germany to mobilize support, or Captain America comics in which the hero punches out Adolf Hitler, or just the use of general propaganda to get every available resource to support the war. Of course, a lot of these strategies to mobilize populations for war were grounded in specific ideologies. Those ideologies of nationalism or extreme patriotism. In Germany and Italy, the ideology of fascism, which preached corporatism, right? Every part of the country coming together for the glory of the state. And in the Soviet Union, it would have been communism, working in the fields to provide for those that need it in this war. You see it especially in the images I've chosen here. These ideologies were ever present in the propaganda used to mobilize populations for war. Now, the sources of global conflict in the first half of the century varied. They included imperialist expansion by European powers and Japan. They also included competition for resources, the economic crisis engendered by the Great Depression, and the rise of fascist and totalitarian regimes to positions of power, whether it be Mussolini or Hitler or Stalin. These things, though, combined together really to set the stage for these unprecedented military conflicts. But after World War II, we see a global balance of economic and political power shift, and that rapidly evolved into the Cold War. The democracy of the United States as one superpower and the communist Soviet Union as the others led to an ideological conflict and power struggle between capitalism on one side, led by the United States and its Western European allies, and communism on the other. The conflict, of course, extended beyond basic ideological origins and had effects on economic, political, social, and even cultural aspects of global events. These conflicts, of course, produced new military alliances. On the side of the United States, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was most significant, and the Soviet Union responded with its Warsaw Pact. Of course, these new military alliances and new ideological alliances also promoted proxy wars between and within post-colonial states, often in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. And some examples of proxy wars include the Chinese Civil War from 1944 to 1949, the crisis in Iran in 1946, the Korean and Vietnam Wars, the Ethiopian Civil War, and other conflicts in places like Chile, the Congo, El Salvador, etc. This conflict really stretched across the globe, and it even stretched outside of these political fights or these military conflicts around the world as well. We see examples of competition between the United States and Soviet Union as well. Here are the images, if you were watching the video instead of just listening, of NATO and the Warsaw Pact. And here are our Cold War hotspots and proxy wars that we had discussed. But this competition spread to things like space. After the Soviets put up Sputnik into space, the space race was on. The United States trailing the Soviets early, as the Soviets not only put a satellite into space first, but also put the first person in space. And the United States luckily wins by changing the finish line and landing on the moon. Still the only country to land a person on the moon. Ultimately, though, this was a competition of economics, capitalism, free market economics versus communist state-run economies. We also see a drive for nuclear supremacy in this Cold War, as both countries undertake an arms race. And this competition was felt everywhere, even in the Olympics, sometimes leading to boycotts of the Olympics over political disagreements, like the United States boycott of Moscow in 1980 and the Soviet boycott of Los Angeles in 1984. In both cases, protesting the other side's involvement in other countries' affairs, like in 1979, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. But that competition was very real. One of the major moments of the United States Olympic glory was in 1980 when the U.S. hockey team defeated the powerful Soviets. Of course, this competition was also seen in Hollywood as well. Movies like Rocky IV, which are sometimes given too much credit in ending this Cold War. So what did end the Cold War? Well, there are three reasons the key concepts give us for the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. One is that we see the expansion of U.S. military spending and technological development. A second is the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which ends up being a money pit for the Soviets, and also kind of demystifies the idea of the Soviets as this all-powerful state that can make anyone around them do what they want. And lastly, and probably most significantly, a general economic weakness and stagnation in communist countries is going to lead to a movement more toward some free market policies, which will open this Eastern Bloc to the West and eventually lead to the disintegration of communist states in the Eastern Bloc. Of course, the Great Wall, the Berlin Wall, getting my time periods significantly confused. The Berlin Wall comes down in 1989, the first signal, really, that this Cold War was nearing its end. Now, although conflict dominated much of the 20th century, many individuals and groups, including states, opposed that trend. Some individuals and groups, however, did intensify conflicts, and so that's what we want to look at in Key Concept 6.2, Roman numeral 5. So, one thing that we see is that groups and individuals challenged many wars of the century, and some promoted the practice of nonviolence as a way to bring about political change. Some examples of individuals who promoted the practice of nonviolence include Mohandas Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr. within the United States, and Nelson Mandela fighting apartheid in South Africa. Gandhi, of course, we've talked about with the independence movement in India. There are some groups and individuals who challenged war, and we saw from the old key concepts, and they have since been removed, but I think are notable, and that includes artists like Pablo Picasso, whose painting Guernica memorialized the German bombing campaigns in Spain during the Spanish Civil War. There was an anti-nuclear movement, of course, that developed in the second half of the 20th century in response to the arms race in the Cold War. And as you see in the bottom right-hand corner, Thich King Duc, a Buddhist monk in Vietnam, self-immolates, lights himself on fire in protest of the violence coming out of the war in Vietnam. These individuals protesting war sought this type of political change. Some groups and individuals, including the non-aligned movement, opposed and promoted alternatives to existing economic, political, and social orders. Now, the non-aligned movement was a group of member states that were not, and still are not, formally aligned with or against any major power bloc, especially in the context of the Cold War. So some examples of groups and individuals opposing or even opposing the existing order or promoting alternatives to the existing order we find with the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa from 1959 to 1994, the global uprisings of 1968, where we see the participants in those uprisings pushing for major changes to the existing order. And even in 1989, the Tiananmen Square protesters in China, symbolized here by the person known as the Tank Man, students protesting in Beijing for more democratic reform within China. Of course, the Chinese government met that with a crackdown on freedom of speech. Nevertheless, these are some examples of how individuals and groups opposed some of the trends of the 20th century. In some cases, militaries and militarized states often responded to the proliferation of conflict in ways that actually ended up intensifying the conflict. We see the rise, for example, of military dictatorships in Chile, in Spain, and in Uganda, the buildup of the military-industrial complex around the world, the increase in weapons trading, which further intensifies these conflicts. And some movements that even fought against the status quo or pushed against the existing order used violence on their own to achieve their political aims. Some examples of this are the Irish Republican Army in Ireland, the ETA, the Basque Homeland and Liberty separatist and nationalist group in the Basque country of Spain and southwestern France, and of course Al-Qaeda, who carried out the 9/11 attacks on the United States. So all of these movements sought, of course, to find ways to shape the world around them. In some cases, if we're looking at Gandhi and King and Mandela, they sought to shape the world around them by the use of nonviolence. Some, like these groups, the Irish Republican Army, the ETA, Al-Qaeda, they sought to use violence instead. But nevertheless, even if they were not doing this at a state level, there are several movements which sought to promote alternatives or promote changes to that existing order, many of which are successful. Some incrementally. If we think about the anti-nuclear movement, there are nuclear arms reduction treaties that are passed throughout the second half of the 20th century. And some are much more successful. The anti-apartheid movement, ending that system and eventually electing Nelson Mandela the first black African president of South Africa. And then some are hopeful, while not achieving their aim. For example, the Tiananmen Square protesters in China, hopeful for some of those changes to come, although maybe not being successful on that day in 1989. So that is key concept 6.2, dealing with our global conflicts and their consequences. And although this is a pretty involved key concept, it covers some of the more significant political events of the 20th century, especially World Wars I and World Wars II, as well as the Cold War. So make sure that you know this key concept fairly well, know some of these examples, especially if we think about decolonization. Knowing some of those examples are going to be vital, especially if you get an essay on the topic. I hope this was helpful, and we have one more video to go as you prepare for your AP World History exam. So best of luck to you, and we'll see you in the next video. Thank you for staying with me. Have a good day.